good morning. My name is Robert White, and I'm going to be talking with you in an extensive lecture and discussion on the topic of the resurrection of Jim Crow. And some of the viewers may be questioning or asking themselves, what is Jim Crow? Well, Jim Crow was a time period when whites in the South and even in the North segregated society and basically set black people back into a condition of slavery. But before we go into resurrecting Jim Crow and having a discussion on Jim Crow, we need to talk about some recent events that have really spurred our interest. We've heard about the Tea Party and the Tea Party rhetoric, and we have seen them flex their muscles politically. But what is the motivation behind it? And is there another time period that we can go to where we see the same, or we hear the same rhetoric and see the same types of things taking place? One of the things that has spawned our interest is the fact of the familiarity of the rhetoric of certain Tea Party members and certain individuals in society, and how what they say is corresponding with what was said 100 some odd years ago. So in this series of Resurrecting Jim Crow, we're going to use some examples, and we're going to state some examples of why we're concerned about the language that we're hearing. I have here in my archives just different excerpts from top news agencies and top magazines and newspaper articles. This one says, Texas set to whitewash U.S. history. And another one says, Sharon Angle, Second Amendment remedies, in parentheses. Another one I have here talks about Virginia's plans to undo or to rewrite history to not include slavery. Why all of a sudden are people tampering with history? And why is it so critical that states like Texas and Virginia and South Carolina are so focused on writing a Confederate history or a slave history or Southern history, excuse me, and not including slavery in it, or not wanting to talk about slavery? Well, one of the reasons that we believe that that's taking place is because they don't want people to know the history. They want to write a history that kind of conceals the technique that was used to undermine black people and black progress in the South. And so when we challenge people to read history and to understand those things that have given birth to the current conditions, then we can pretty much predict what's going to happen. We can predict and prepare for the political techniques that people are going to use to try to undermine African Americans and undermine really America's way of life again. A lot of people don't know that there was a time period right after slavery when black people, through the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, were able to begin to establish for themselves a foundation. A lot of people have not been taught about a time period called Reconstruction, when the North was able to come to the South, and while there's much debate over whether the Northern insurgency into the South was good or bad, we do know that black people earned the right to vote, or were given the right to vote, received equal protection, due process under the law, and were given the opportunity to vote. And what did they do with that vote? What did they do with their freedom? What did they do with their newfound status? They elected themselves to office. I have a book here. It's called Black Americans in Congress, 1870 to 2007. A lot of people don't know that right after the Civil War, African Americans elected themselves to office. Pull it up so you can see. And so we think that a lot of our political accomplishments are recent, when in all actuality, there were hundreds of blacks elected to public office in the South right after the Civil War. And so the reason why we're not taught these things is because once we began to teach that there was a time period when African Americans were making progress, there was a time period when African Americans were moving forward. If we have to analyze that information, we also have to answer the question, what happened to it? We also have to answer the question, what was done to undermine some of the people that are mentioned in this book? And this is a big book, which means that there were a lot of accomplishments that African Americans had made, but those accomplishments were undergirded by the mob. They were undergirded by a vanguard, if you would, of whites. And the rhetoric of the Tea Party and even the techniques of the Tea Party are so similar to them. And so in this series, Resurrecting Jim Crow, we're going to talk about that. I pulled a newspaper article. It's about 2 years old, from the Montgomery Advertiser. And it says, a little-known chapter of history. Historians highlight first black legislative caucus. It's 123 African Americans elected to the state legislature right after the Civil War. 123. So when people say that voting doesn't do anything, or I'm not going to vote, it's not going to count, people that say those things are ignorant of history. Your vote does count. It has always counted. But what do you do after you vote? And who is it that you vote for? We don't know that Louisiana had a black governor. We don't know that South Carolina at the time during Reconstruction at various points had a majority of blacks in the state legislature. What happened to these people? Mississippi had U.S. congressmen. Alabama elected black U.S. congressmen. What happened to them? What happened to the power structure that black people were building? We have to understand that the Civil War ended in 1865. And the majority of your historically black colleges and universities began to crop up in the South right after the Civil War. Alabama State University in particular was founded in 1867, Lincoln Normal School, Marion, Alabama. 2 years after the Civil War, Benton Pinchback was elected as governor of Louisiana and lieutenant governor of Louisiana right after the Civil War. Peyton Finley was elected the first black Alabama State Board of Education member in the state of Alabama. And so it wouldn't be 100 years later before we would get another one. Why would black people elect themselves to office if they were ignorant? Why would black people assert themselves in a political fashion, not a violent fashion? There were no shots fired. There were no violent uprisings. African Americans did what they were supposed to do, and they began to build for themselves a future. W.B. Du Bois, the greatest, in my opinion, the greatest American intellect that we have produced, published an essay entitled The Propaganda of History. And in it, he quoted other people who had made up lies and myths about the Southern Negro congressmen or the Southern Negro elected officials, which really applied to black people in general. He says that one of those myths was that all Negroes were ignorant. And he quotes different people that had made statements that were placed in history books that children would read, concerning the alleged incompetence of black legislators and black elected officials in the South. Brother, can you get a shot of that? The Propaganda of History. W.B. Du Bois. You can pick up his reader, you can go on the internet and look it up, and you'll see how the techniques that were used to undermine black people and black success were forged. What was the technique? Why did we have all of these black elected officials? And I want to show some more from this book. Why would we have so many black elected officials from the South if black people were ignorant and incompetent? Why is that the case? Well, it wasn't the case. Black people were building for themselves a future.